Hello and welcome to this week's Sunday sit-down video when I talk about a board game design related topic in detail. And today I am going to add a fourth mechanism to my list of my favorite mechanisms in games in general. In the past I've added I Cut You Choose, engine building, and worker placement to this list. And recently I realized just how much I love time tracks in games. And by time tracks specifically, I mean tracks that you are advancing on these tracks in one direction, and usually those tracks determine your turn order and have usually some better things if you advance further on the track, and you have the option of advancing further on the track rather than just going one by one, slot by slot. I'll go into some more detail about this. I'm leaving this a little vague because some of the games that I'm going to mention do this in some unique and different ways. And this isn't necessarily the same as using time as a resource. There are a few games I love, notably Tzolk'in, that uses time as a resource. And I love Tzolk'in. I thought about making this video just about time as a resource, but I wanted to go specifically into time tracks. Tzolk'in uses time as a resource, but it does not feature time tracks. The classic example, so I have 10 games I'm going to talk about. And the classic example is Tokaido. And Tokaido isn't the first game to use this mechanism, but in Tokaido you have a little worker that's going on a walk across Japan, and you get to choose how far on the track you want to go based on the things that you need. Or the things that you want in the game. This might be based on your character's abilities, some other things that you've gained previously in the game. And this is the key part of the time track, that you get to choose in Tokaido how far forward you want to go. Now, there is a limit in Tokaido, and this is a very, very important innovation in Tokaido, in that I think the track in total probably has around 20, 25 spaces on it, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little less. But on your first turn, you can't just jump ahead to spot number 25, because I think the game designer, Bowza, knew that if he let people do that, some people would do that, and their game would be over immediately. Because in Tokaido, a key part of it is that the current player is the player who's the furthest back on the time track. So if players 1 and 2 jump way ahead on the time track, player 3 can just take each spot one by one until they catch up with the other players, and then those players get turns. This is another topic I'll talk about downtime in a few minutes. But anyway, the innovation that Tokaido does is it makes you stop at inns along the way. So every 6 or 7 spaces, there is an inn where you must stop. And if you want, on your very first turn of the game, you can jump forward all the way to the inn and be the first player in the inn, and there is an advantage to being the first player in the inn. But most players won't do that. They'll take little stops along the way. But I love this innovation that the game helps players not jump too far ahead by preventing them, by saying you can't do that. You have to stop at these inns along the way. I think that's a very clever innovation. One of the games that I have that didn't occur to me at first when I thought about time tracks, but it does have one in the game, is Rajas of the Ganges. This is one that delves a little bit outside of the realm of normal time tracks, because in the game you are not using time as a mechanism. You're taking turns one after another as you would in many other worker placement games. But there is one track in the game that serves very similarly to many time tracks, and that is the river track in the game. This is a one-way track, just like time tracks. You're going one direction, you cannot go back. And you have the ability to jump way forward on this track, or jump 1, 2, or 3 spaces forward. And there's even an ability where you can jump 6 spaces forward on this track. And this is where the really interesting decision comes into play in Rajas, because the better abilities, and usually the abilities associated with points, and also just some great abilities, are further down on the track. You have to jump way ahead to get to those spaces. In addition, there is a gain an extra worker space that's pretty far down on the track as well, on the river track. But if you do that, if you jump way ahead, which is a viable strategy in the game, you're going to miss out on lots of smaller actions along the way. And that's the great thing about these one-way time tracks. You can't go back. So every time you jump forward on the track, it's an interesting decision because you're getting something better that you want, but you're giving up on things that you can never get again. And I love that element of time tracks. And Rajas, the river in Rajas of the Ganges, I think makes that really, really interesting, especially putting that extra worker near the end of the track and giving you the ability to jump way ahead on that track if you want to kind of go after that extra worker. That makes for some really interesting decisions in the game. Yeah, so that's Rajas of the Ganges. Thebes is next. Thebes is one that I actually need to do a video on soon because I played Thebes for the first time recently. It's an archaeology-based game that uses a time track as the main resource of the game. You're spending time to do pretty much everything that you're doing in the game. And like many of these games with time tracks, the current player is the one that's furthest back on the track. Unlike Tokaido, Thebes only has players really stop. It only forces players to stop 3 times in the game, and that's 3 years of the game that you're playing. And so I was trying to think about what Thebes does to prevent downtime, because downtime could be a huge problem in Thebes. If I'm just taking one action one at a time, one by one, the other players are going to wait a while before it's their turn. But I think Thebes accomplishes this in 2 ways. One is that the turns are very fast. You are just spending time, and usually then you're gaining a card. And the other part of it is the only turns that take a little bit longer are the turns where you're actually digging, where you're going on the archaeological dig. And those turns, as far as I know, for my one play of Thebes, is that you need to take those turns at some point in the game, and really a few times a year, to even have a chance at winning the game. And so I think this is what Thebes does to encourage players, or kind of, it essentially forces players, but it makes it feel like they have control. It forces players to take those big, time-consuming turns every now and then, so that players aren't waiting a lot of time between turns. It kind of requires you to take those turns that take a bunch of time, so you're not stuck way far behind. But I need to play Thebes again, because I am almost impressed by how little downtime there was in the game that we played, given that players could spend 8 time on a turn compared to a player just spending 1 or 2 time. It still seemed like there was very little downtime in the game. So that's Thebes. I will talk a little bit more about downtime for one of these other games. Let's talk about another game that I have here, and that is Patchwork. In Patchwork, you have 2 main resources. You have time and you have buttons, and you're spending time on a time track. Again, the player who is furthest in the back of the track is the current player. And Patchwork, I think one really interesting thing Patchwork does is that on this time track, it gives you a strong reason to, even though you kind of want to hang back and take as many turns as possible, there are tokens on the track itself, little square tokens, that are really appealing for you to pick up. They fill in some gaps in your Patchwork quilt that are otherwise very difficult to fill in. And so I love that Patchwork gives players that little reason to jump ahead to grab those scarce resources, because once I jump ahead and I pick up one of those little those squares, it's gone. I pick it up off the track. It is gone permanently. So I really like that Patchwork has a limited resource that's on the track itself, giving players a little bit of a reason not just to hold back with their time. Also, Patchwork kind of forces you to spend time, because the tiles that you're picking up in the game, it's not a choice to say, okay, I'm spending 1 time or 2 time. It's the tiles that you're picking up that tell you how much time that you're going to spend. It does another thing. Well, it does a couple of things. I'll just talk about it here, because that's what Sunday Sit-Downs are all about. I can talk for a while about games. Patchwork also says if you run out of buttons, you can jump ahead on the time track to gain a bunch of buttons, and you'll gain buttons equal to the number of spaces that you jump ahead. There is a limit. I think you jump ahead, you jump onto, or maybe 1 space ahead. I think it's 1 space ahead of the other player. It's a 2-player game. And so at times you might run out of buttons, and you might just need to jump ahead to get some more buttons that way. I really like that they give you that ability, and they tie buttons to time in that way. And the last thing, one of these games, I won't mention which one it is, but there is one of these games that doesn't do this well. But I think a key element in these time track games is that it is easy, if the game allows for the stacking of tokens. So like in Patchwork, I can put my token on top of your token, and I remain the current player if I do that. I think it's crucially important that the tokens on the time track are easy to pick up. And Patchwork does this really well. A lot of them use circular tokens like this. And as you can see, I believe this is a 1 centimeter. Yeah. This is a 1 centimeter tall token, and this is the right amount for a token that you need to frequently pick up and stack and unstack. I think this is the way to go. Don't go thinner than 1 centimeter for time track token. I think this is really, really important. Otherwise, it becomes annoying and fiddly, and you're slipping the tokens all over the place. I think that was a good call by Patchwork. All right, a game that I don't have is Francis Drake. Francis Drake is kind of 2 games in one. One is this game involving sending ships out to sea. I don't particularly enjoy that part of the game, but I love the other half of the game of Francis Drake, which is a beautiful time track / worker placement track. So it's not just time in Francis Drake that you're spending. There are benefits. It's a little similar to Tokaido, where there are a ton of different benefits on a track. That I think the idea is that you're either like walking through the city or you're walking through a dockyard before you get to your ship, and there's lots of stuff along the way, lots of little markets and people that you can visit along the way before you get to your ship. And your choice is, okay, do I jump ahead to the really valuable stuff or the stuff that I need, or do I go one by one along these spaces? And the unique thing that Francis Drake does with these spaces is that some of them allow for more than one player to place workers there, whereas some of them do not. And so there's this nice tension provided there and a little bit of flexibility provided there, because there are some spaces where you might grab them. It kind of conveys the value of the space by the number of available actions there. There might be a space that has only one space available there. And so you might want to grab that so you can block out other players and wait for them to, because they'll have to pass you. You don't get to go until they've all gone, until they've all passed you on that track. But I also just like that it conveys the value. When you're learning the game, you don't know the value of these different things. You know if something only has one space, it's probably worth more. It's worth more than the space that has like 3 available slots for workers. That's Francis Drake. I'll talk about one other game that I don't have here. Actually, yeah, let's talk about Time Stories. One of my favorite games of all time is, I think, the first game on this list that is cooperative. Yeah, it actually might be the only game on this list that is cooperative. So in Time Stories, it is essentially you're just using time as a mechanism. There's a time track that you're spending time on. There's one token for all players. So whenever you spend time, whether you're going from one location to the next or you're in a location and you need to make a decision involving time, you will spend time on that track. This is probably the one that maybe it shouldn't belong on this list, because you are literally just spending time as a resource. You're not jumping ahead. You're not spending a bunch of time to do certain things. But at times in the game, you will have choices about time where it says, okay, you can spend 5 time to do this thing, or you can spend 0 time or no time to do this. So it does at times feel like that you're deciding whether or not to jump ahead on that track or not. I would love to see, and I've been thinking about this in my open world cooperative game. Time is a little bit of a resource in the game, but I was thinking about Time Stories and how there's only one token there. And I've been playing around with the idea in my game of determining turn order by a shared time track where everyone has their own token. So if I'm spending a lot of time doing something and you're not, I will jump ahead on the time track, and you will spend a little bit more time. You'll spend less time doing smaller things until you catch up with me. I don't know if this is a good idea or not though, because it does, again, run into the problem of downtime. I'm just thinking that maybe in a cooperative game, downtime isn't as big of a problem, because even if I spend my turn to do one big thing and I jump ahead on the time track, I am still involved in the other player's turns. And so that downtime may not be as big of a deal in a cooperative game because of that reason. I don't know if I'm going to do that, but I'm playing around with it. And if you know of any cooperative games that use a time track where every player has their own token on the track, I'd love to hear those examples in the comments. So the other game, this is actually the game that got me starting to think about this, is AuZtralia. I just played this for the first time the other day. This is it's a competitive game. with a time track and a slightly semi-cooperative element. But the really cool thing about AuZtralia with the time track that it uses is that there is a Cthulhu token on that track. I think it represents the old ones. So at a certain point in the game, players just take turns one after another using the time as a resource. The player furthest in the back goes until you reach there's another token that you place on the track at the beginning of the game. I think you place it on like space 20 or something on the track. Once you reach that token also becomes like a player in that it is taking turns. It is spending one time on its turn to do something. And that's representative of the old ones in the game. It's an AI in the game that participates in the time track. And I just thought, when I saw this, I thought that was absolutely brilliant. That not only do you have players competing against each other for time, but you have an AI player controlled by that is on the time track with you. And because sometimes I think in AI games, when there's AI, the game, it's a little fiddly to like remember when the AI needs to go. Like maybe it always goes between player A and player B, or maybe it goes after every player's turn or after every round. But I really like how organically it integrates into a time track, because you're always in a time track game, you're looking at the last, or not always, but most of the time you're looking at the last player and they are taking a turn. And so if that last player is the AI, it's very clear, okay, it's their turn. We can't forget this. It's very easy to remember to do it. So I thought that was just brilliant to have a third-party AI on the time track itself taking turns. Really, really clever, especially in a competitive game. I could see that easily being integrated into a cooperative game. All right, so that was AuZtralia. The game that I remember the least is Glen More. I've only played Glen More once. And as I recall, the innovative thing about Glen More is that the tiles, the time track itself, is randomly generated every round with tiles. So you're randomly creating this time track. I think this is unique from all the other games that I mentioned so far. Tokaido, Rajas, Thebes. I'm pretty sure Francis Drake is not randomly generated. But Glen More has a bunch of different tiles that you're collecting along the time track. And you're deciding how far ahead do I jump on this time track to get the tile that I really want. But I'm going to miss out on all these other little tiles along the way. I think in Glen More there's a cost to those tiles, but I can't remember a cost other than time. It's just been a while since I played it. But I really like that randomization. It creates a ton of variability in the game. And every round you're kind of excited, okay, what's going to come out? How far ahead do I need to jump? And as the game progresses and you know exactly which tiles you need, that tension really, really heightens. Another twist on this in particular, and I think this is a great compromise between that randomness and the preset aspects of Tokaido, is Egizia. Egizia is a game that I played at Geekway to the West a few years ago. And in Egizia, every round, you set out, I think it's around 10 to 12 cards on the track. And they're all on one side of the track. And you can jump ahead to these cards, you can grab them, you can take them, and you can have them as your own, as you would in the time track. On the other side of the track are preset actions that also cost time to jump to. Also, you can jump ahead to them and block out other players from taking them. But I love that there's a preset side and a randomized side throughout the game. I think that's a brilliant compromise between the two. It gives the game designer some control. It says, okay, these actions are always going to be available for you, and this is the value that those actions are worth. Like the ones further on the track are usually worth more. And there's also this random element that keeps a lot of replayability and variability in the game. I love that duality between the set track and the randomized track in Egizia. I think I've done all but one. Yeah, okay. I'll end with this one because I think this one does something really, really interesting. This is Heaven and Ale. And in Heaven and Ale, the big catch in this game, there is a little bit of randomization. There's pretty much a preset track, but with a little bit of randomization. But the biggest twist in this game is that turn order is not decided by your order on the time track. Turn order in Heaven and Ale is just one player after another as normal. But Heaven and Ale gives you many, many reasons to jump ahead on the track versus going for a lesser token or just like the next thing on the track. And it mostly does this by adding some costs. There are some really expensive things and some cheaper things that you maybe can or cannot afford. But I love this little twist on it because as much as I love the idea of time tracks where the last player goes first, it works really well in that, like AuZtralia, like I mentioned, when you have an AI on the track in particular. It can lead to a lot of downtime in a game with a time track if you are taking the big action and then everyone else takes little small actions. I tried this in Charterstone. For a while in Charterstone, time was a resource in the game, and it led to just a ton of downtime, partially because Charterstone goes up to 6 players, and partially because I had actions that you could spend 5 or 6 time on because they were very, very valuable actions. So you would spend 6 time, and you would wait forever before you could actually take your next turn. Heaven and Nail completely solves this issue, in my opinion, by letting players take turns one after another in clockwise order as normal, but you're still spending time on this track. It's still a one-way track that you cannot go back on, so you're still jumping way ahead on the track sometimes to grab something you want, but you still get your next turn, so you stay ahead on that track, and you still have, like, that means that you all of a sudden are putting pressure on the other players to jump ahead because you jump so far ahead. They know, okay, Jamey can't choose actions A through E anymore. He went for F. But that means that Jamey is definitely not choosing actions A through E now. And even though I can take them, Jamey might go ahead and jump ahead to action J or action K that I really want. And so it puts pressure on the other players to maybe jump ahead themselves. There is still a catch-up spot there is like an end of the round spot where the round ends and you have to reseed the board, which I think is necessary in a game like Heaven and Nail. But I love that turn order continues as normal, so there's no downtime, or there's very limited downtime in Heaven and Nail. Let me see if I have any other notes here. Okay, yeah, I do have a few other little notes. So I've talked about some of the main, some issues that can arrive from time tracks and some of the solutions that you can that some of these games have provided. I did want to bring up Crystal Clans, which I haven't played, and Stronghold, which do use time as a resource. They don't have time tracks, but I wanted to bring them up because I just love the idea in these games where you're using time as a resource, and the time that I spend ends up, especially in Stronghold, I'm not sure if this is the case in Crystal Clans, but in Stronghold in particular, the time that I spend on my turn gives you a resource that you get to spend on your turn. Because if I'm spending more time on my turn doing something, planning something, then you have more time yourself to do something as well as a 2-player game. And I love that idea. It's very similar to a time track where if I'm spending a lot of time jumping ahead on a track, you have more time to do other things on that track. But I think in Stronghold, you're using like these little cubes that represent time. And in Crystal Clans, I feel like there's something like that. I think there's a track that adjusts in some way like that, where the time that I spend impacts the amount of time that you get to spend on your turn, which I think is really, really clever. But in general, I am just enamored. I fully realized recently how much I love these time tracks, because I love the tension between jumping ahead to something really important that you want versus staying behind and using time really efficiently. I love the variability it provides, especially in a game like Egizia or Glen More. And I don't know, I won't rehash everything I just talked about, but I love all these innovations, and I found that I think I want to use this in a game someday. I love this mechanism so much that I definitely want to use it in a game, whether it's my cooperative game or a competitive game in the future. I'd love to hear your thoughts on these games, the idea of time tracks. If you want to talk about time as a resource, you can. That isn't the main focus here, but if you want to talk about that, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if there are other games that I haven't mentioned on this list that use time tracks that I should play, please recommend them. I'd love to hear what you love about them, and I would love to play them myself and learn more about them. That's it for Sunday Sit Down this week. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you on Tuesday for another My Favorite Game Mechanism video. Take care.